It was meant to be just another routine day in the silent heart of the church. No official statement, no scheduled liturgical celebration. The Vatican rested under the discreet weight of its own rituals, like a monastery disguised as a diplomatic headquarters, but that morning time seemed to stand still. Pope Leo XIV, without prior notice, appeared alone. No entourage, no Swiss guard, just him, the successor of Peter, walking through the cold corridors of the Roman Curia as if obeying an invisible command. There were no official cameras, no liturgical protocol, but a single self-indiscreet trembling. The moment Leo XIV entered the crypt and knelt before the tomb of Francis, the dim light of the underground chapel rested on his bowed face, hidden between clasped hands. There were no words, no homily, only silence. A silence so dense it seemed to cry out. The image spread within minutes. First among the halls of the Vatican, then among perplexed journalists. In just a few hours it flooded Catholic networks around the world. And everyone asked, what does this mean? But no explanation came, no official note, no speech, because it wasn't meant to be explained. It was meant to be felt. The Pope's gestures so unexpected, so solemn, so humanoid, the veil between the visible and the invisible. This was not merely a man visiting a tomb, it was a shepherd praying for his flock, a father carrying the pain of his children, a sinner begging for mercy. And those who saw understood. They understood that, in that moment, Leo XIV was doing something no encyclical could contain. He was offering his whole heart back to heaven. And by doing so, he reopened a door the church itself had locked from within. The door to the sacred. After leaving the crypt, Leo XIV did not return to his chambers. He walked on foot alone to the Basilica of St. Mary Major. It was as if he were following a path drawn not by the architects of the Vatican, but by something deeper within. There, before the ancient icon of the Virgin Salus Populi Romani, the Pope knelt once more, this time not for Francis, but for all, for us, for you. The image of the mother, darkened by time, marked by war and centuries of tears, seemed to gaze back at him, and he, like a son carrying the weight of an entire family, simply fell silent. No words, no song, just the muffled sound of a man praying with his whole body. It was not theater, it was not a spectacle, it was a sacrifice. The Pope was not asking for glory, not for fame, not even for understanding. He was asking for something the church had long forgotten to ask for. Mercy, mercy for the lukewarm faithful, for weary priests, for lost youth, for forgotten elders, for enemies, for traitors, for saints, for skeptics, for those who still believe and for those who can no longer believe. It was a prayer so universal that no doctrine could limit it, so intimate that no document could describe it. The Pope's gesture spoke in a language that transcended borders, ideologies, and traditions, the language of the bowed knee. And while theologians tried to interpret it, the people already knew. They felt, they wept, they returned. Because when a pope kneels, something on earth bows with him. The Vatican attempted to contain the avalanche of interpretations. A brief bureaucratic statement was issued. His Holiness sought consolation and discernment in silent prayer. But the image had already spoken louder. The silence of the Pope, that thick, reverent, almost mystical silence, imposed itself on the world's noise like an invisible altar. Political leaders fell silent. Intellectuals were stunned. Critics expected speeches but received tears. And ordinary people, the people of faith, responded in the only way they know when God manifests, with adoration. Abandoned chapels began to fill again. Forgotten confessions were sought once more. Cold hearts were rekindled, and all because of a gesture that no communication strategy could have foreseen. What Leo XIV offered that day wasn't a statement. It was a liturgy. The liturgy of a body surrendered, of a heart torn open, of a silence that heals. Discouraged young priests began to celebrate Mass with renewed reverence. Religious sisters rediscovered the meaning of their vows. Families began to pray together again. The sign had been given, and those with eyes to see saw, because the church does not need new slogans, it needs new holiness. And that day the Pope did not preach. He lived it by uniting in a single gesture the tomb of Francis and the icon of Mary. Leo XIV drew an invisible map, a line that links death to life, the visible end to the eternal beginning, the Pope of the present to the womb of the Mother of the Church. Francis represented time, Mary, eternity, and Leo XIV, as the living bridge between the two, revealed something no synod could decree, that the renewal of the church will not come through reform but through resurrection, and every resurrection begins with a bent knee. Since that day, the tomb of Francis, once merely a historical marker, has been visited as an altar of tears, not for the glories of the past, but for the prophetic gesture of a successor who wept there for the entire church. And before the Virgin Salus Populi Romani, many understood the most powerful prayer is the one made without words. The Vatican issued no documents, convened no meetings, organized no events, because there was nothing to organize. Grace had descended and the response had to be personal. It was not a time to think, it was a time to kneel. And many understood even weeks later. The gesture of Leo XIV continues to resonate. It is no longer just an image, it is an icon, a mirror, a silent summons to all who still believe that heaven speaks and that sometimes speaks through tears. Letters poured into the Vatican from every continent. None demanded reforms. All spoke of pain, of hope, of conversion. People wrote, "Holy Father, we wept too," and it was true. Because those who saw that gesture did not see a pope, they saw a father who carries the sins of his children, who kneels for those who no longer know how to pray, who intercedes for those who have fallen away, who still believes that church is more than its structure, it is its soul. This gesture, so small, so simple, so ignored by the powerful, is now the breath rekindling forgotten altars, the wind that clears the dust from abandoned tabernacles, the living reminder that God still visits his people not in applause, but in silence. Now the question is no longer about the Pope, it is about us. Did we hear the call? Will we respond? Because he knelt, but the ones who need to rise are us. On the Church's long history, many gestures have been interpreted as signs, miracles, or divine warnings. But what happened with Pope Leo XIV surpasses any compilation of canonized miracles or revealed prophecies. There were no stigmata, no emphasis on visions or spectacular interventions. There was only silence, a silence that descended upon the Vatican like a heavy mantle, like a spiritual eclipse, like a pause from heaven in the history of earth. Leo XIV, kneeling before the tomb of Francis, said nothing. But that silence was so dense, so radical, so spiritually charged, that it broke through political logic, disarmed journalists, and silenced those who had used the church as an ideological trench for years. Priests wept, religious resumed their prayers, and lay people who had abandoned the sacraments felt their hearts beat once more. What happened was not visible to human eyes, but it was recognized by awakened souls. God had spoken, and he had spoken through a supernatural silence. The gesture of Pope Leo XIV had an impact that went beyond the Curia. The images of the Holy Father in tears before the Virgin Salus Populi Romani spread like spiritual incense over a fragmented church. Conservatives and progressives stopped, accusing each other. Atheists fell silent. Bishops who hadn't spoken in years gathered to pray, and all of this without a single word being spoken. The Pope's tears were not a political gesture, nor a pastoral strategy. They were a sacrament, a cry, a response, as if saying, "The Church weeps, and I weep with her." In that moment, Leo XIV ceased to be merely the successor of Peter. He became the face of Christ's wounded soul, and everyone from palaces to slums recognized there was a true shepherd there. Without issuing a single official document, without calling a press conference, without naming any committees, Leo XIV pointed the way. By kneeling first at the tomb of Francis and then before the image of the Virgin, he traced a spiritual map, from collapse to restoration, from death to resurrection, from scandal to redemption. Each gesture became a prophetic symbol. The tomb represented the wounded past, the Virgin, the future waiting to be reborn, the silence, the spirit that must once again be heard, and the tear, the only language God understands when the human heart no longer knows how to pray. That path was opened. It is now up to the Church to follow or ignore it. For decades, the Church has faced the growing indifference of her children. The Mass became an obligation, the altar a stage, the Eucharist was trivialized, but with the gesture of Leo XIV, something began to crack. The walls of indifference started to tremble. Like the trumpets of Jericho, the Pope's silence was the final note that shook the defenses built against the sacred. In the days that followed the gesture, reports of conversions exploded. Confessions long delayed took place again. Empty churches came back to life. Religious returned to fasting. The liturgy regained its solemnity. And it all began with a single bent knee, one man's gesture, but a gesture carried by God. Officially, the Vatican tried to reduce the gesture to a personal act of devotion. But the people saw what Rome would not declare. There was a sign. There was something beyond control, something that even Vatican diplomacy could not manage. This wasn't strategy. It was intercession. Leo XIV had touched the invisible, and the invisible responded. The angels were present. The saints trembled. And the Virgin Mary, silent as always, welcomed the Church into her heart. What the Vatican did not explain, the Spirit revealed. And it doesn't matter what the documents don't say, because heaven had already spoken. Some gestures touched the earth, others pierced the heavens, but a few so read as Psalm hell itself. The silence of Leo XIV before the tomb of Francis and the Virgin Salus Populi Romani became more than a holy image. It became a spiritual earthquake, an invisible tremor whose waves rippled through heavenly and infernal realms. Many exorcists would report unusual unrest in their prayers days later. Cases of spontaneous deliverance, rushed confessions, and a cry that seemed to rise from souls. The urgent longing to return to the sacred. Hell feeds on indifference, and when a pope kneels, he breaks the fast of souls who had forgotten how to tremble. Leo XIV knelt not out of strategy but out of interior obedience, and that obedience shook hell itself, because what the devil fears most is not a powerful pope, but a holy one. Holiness dismantles fortresses, corrects doctrines with a single glance, converts hearts without a word. And that is what happened. The gesture was not planned. It was inspired. Leo XIV did not declare war, but he did what the saints do. He invoked heaven with the weight of silence. And when heaven is invoked in purity, hell groans in despair. That is what the world did not see, but felt, while Rome was still processing the gesture. A spiritual upheaval had already begun in places where the church bleeds in silence. In China, in Iran, in parts of Africa where the Eucharist is celebrated in secret, where priests live knowing they might die at any mass. The image of Leo XIV kneeling arrived there like a flame. Missionaries reported unexpected renewals. Young people asking for baptism. Underground churches filled to capacity. Men and women embracing the risks of faith with new fervor. What a gesture can do, when it is anointed by heaven, defies all human logic. Leo XIV touched a hidden point in the soul of the global church. The reminder that to be church is also to be willing to suffer with Christ. The martyrs, the seed of the church, seemed to smile from above, as if saying, "He remembered, the Pope remembered us," not with monuments or tributes, but with knees on the ground and an exposed heart. It was a silent tribute to those who died for the faith, and a powerful invocation for new saints to rise from hidden blood and fidelity. The history of the church holds invisible markers, days that will not be remembered through documents but through signs. The gesture of Leo XIV was one of those days, a spiritual turning point, prophetic, as if something had ended and something new had begun. Cardinals reported strange dreams that night. Theologians experienced a void followed by a peace they had never known. Entire families began to pray again around their dinner tables. It was as if the collective soul of the church was being cleansed. Prophecy does not always come in words. Sometimes it comes through gestures, and this gesture was the symbol of a new circle opening. Leo XIV did not write a new rule. He inaugurated a new time, the time of returning to the interior altar, the time of restoring the sacred, the time of listening to the Spirit. He reopened the circle of adoration, and all who enter it will discover nothing will be the same again. As the weeks passed, the fruits began to emerge, but they were different fruits, not loud, not statistical. Fruits that only the Spirit recognizes, like a soul reconciling after 40 years away. A man walking into a church for the first time without knowing why. A young woman, in the midst of depression, picking up a rosary and crying without explanation. These fruits don't make headlines, but they are written in the book of life, because every harvest of silence is invisible but real. And this was the harvest that began. The Pope's gesture, by not demanding, by not imposing, made room for the Spirit to act as he prefers, gently, without force, without intrusion, just a touch. And so, the fruits bloomed, through simplicity, through humility, through reverence, through the longing for the sacred heaven. If many did not know, they still carried it. All of this brings us to the inevitable point: what about us? Because the gesture of Leo XIV was not just meant to be contemplated, it was a call, a mirror, a question for every Christian still brave enough to ask, does my faith still burn? Do my eyes still fill with tears when I speak to God? Do I still know how to kneel? That gesture, that silence, that kneeling, is now before us like a lamp. It doesn't light the future with maps and answers, but with interior light, and it is up to each one of us to decide, will we follow? Will we walk through the door that has been unlocked? Leo XIV took the first step, but it's not enough for one pope to kneel. Now, the whole church must bend its knees. Every home must reclaim a corner for prayer. Every soul must long for holiness again. Every heart must sigh even in dryness. Lord, I want to return. If this silent gesture of Pope Leo XIV spoke to your soul, don't ignore it. This is not guilt. This is grace. It is heaven calling you back. Leave in the comments, Lord, I want to kneel. To share this video with someone who has lost a faith or someone who still carries a flicker in their chest. Subscribe and activate the bell to receive more messages like this, because sometimes a bent knee is the beginning of your resurrection.